We've really been enjoying our time here talking with Scott today. Braver Collective is going to be soft launching by the end of June and then launching publicly by the end of July. And we have been talking about so many things that we never really got around to talking about his financial platform. So in the time remaining that we have with Scott, we're going to talk a little bit about revenues and fundraising and scaling and all the other things that people don't usually like to talk about, but we do because we're here at Project 42. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of Project 42, the podcast that is created by and is about survivors and the mission of building awareness around the incidence of sexual abuse in our culture. We have some exciting news to share with you about the latest developments in terms of growing and building the platform for Project 42. We also are very delighted to have my good friend Scott Dille with us here today. Scott and I go back 4 or 5 years. Scott is the founder of a very unique organization project. He'll tell you what he wants us to call it, called Braver Collective, that is unlike anything that I have ever seen in this mission area. And I've been at it for 30 years, so when I tell you it's new and different, it's new and different. I'm going to punt this over to my good friend and colleague, Derek, who's going to bring you up to date on what's going on with Project 42. And then we're going to turn it over to Scott, because he's got a lot to say and we got a lot to ask him.
Yeah, I don't want to hog too much time, but the branding of all of our social media, website, podcasts, all the places you have come to find us and love us, that is going to be all up and running by the next time you see our next episode. I said next twice.
We're going to have to make we need a fancy sign or something, you know.
Said next twice. So that's going to be all up and running very, very soon. I don't want to hog too much time about us because you hear us talk about us all the time. So I'm just going to I'm going to read what you guys have on your current landing page right now. And, you know, we're honored to be with Scott Dille, the founder of Braver Collective. What is the Braver Collective? You could just go to bravercollective.org. Yeah, bravercollective.org.
Oh, you got a .org.
So Braver Collective is a healing community built by survivors, with survivors, and for survivors of sexual abuse and trauma. Together, they're building a welcoming, accessible, digital space where people of all ages and experiences can find and share stories, resources, and support for their journey. Wow. So the first thing that I want you to lead in with, Scott, is big problems need a big solution. So, and this is one of the most beautiful solutions I've ever seen for, our mission area. How did it all start?
Well, and thank you, Derek, and thank you, Jean, for the opportunity to be here and for all the work that you guys are doing in support of survivors and survivor healing. Yeah, the start of all of this, so I'm a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, and about 6 years ago now, found myself watching the USA gymnast testify against Dr. Nasser in his sentencing hearing. And I'd been in about 10 more years of therapy at the time, and I just was feeling like I was in a place where I was just so inspired by what they were doing and the courage, both individually and as a community. I just started thinking, I have, like all of us, I have a toolkit, and I know how under-resourced this space is, and I just felt like I wanted to go out and, like you and a lot of other people, go out and just try to understand this space better and see where we might make a difference. And at the time I was co-leading a digital design lab for a big bank. So we were doing research with clients around their lived experience and how that might factor into the products and services we offered, and incubating businesses and so on, doing the same thing with employees. And we were using teams of designers who were practicing human-centered design in the lab, which is a particular design practice that goes much deeper in terms of researching the lived experience in scenarios where that really makes a big difference. There's a lot of problems out in the world where the lived experience is not that relevant. But there are problems where the lived experience really lies at the heart of understanding the problem to be solved and how you might go about doing that. So we had teams of people who were practicing in this way, and that was part of my toolkit, basically. So we just put together, I think, 10 different ideas on different ways that we might be in support of the survivor healing space, in support of survivors as they sought to heal, and went out and started talking to people who run nonprofits in this space and just people involved in this movement, and just saying, in a really open way, is like, what of this, if anything, really would move the needle? And our aspiration was to do something that had the potential to impact this space at scale. That was our hope. Just again, knowing how under-resourced this space is, as we all do.
When we're all done here, I am going to invite everybody to give me an example of a project or an area where lived experiences are irrelevant. I would really like to know more about that.
Math problems.
Yeah.
Okay, which is kind of like my way of segueing to the first thing I wanted to ask, and I'm glad you led off with that in your description, because a lot of people will toss around a phrase like survivor-spaced or, designed in cooperation with survivors or whatever, and you can say whatever you want in order to make yourself sound good, but you, my friend, you really did it, and you did it in a way that must have required an incredible amount of patience and understanding, because having a team of people design anything is much harder than doing it yourself. So if you would, I wish you would talk a little bit, I know a little bit of the background here, talk a little bit about how you got survivors involved, your panel, how they've been involved at every step of the process, maybe even times when you wish they weren't because it was slowing things down. I don't know, I'm joking. But, and I'm a survivor myself, as all you watchers and listeners out there know. I always worked very hard in all my endeavors too, to make sure that I was working in ways that were comfortable, in ways that honored and protected survivors in every way possible. But I know how hard it could be sometimes, so that's why I want you to tell us about what you guys did, because it's the one thing that has made you so incredibly unique.
Yeah, so as a survivor, I knew that the voice that would be not only most important, but really the single voice that we had to understand and lift up was the survivor voice. And so from the very beginning, as soon as we could get to survivors, we were just doing deep research into their lives and how trauma showed up, what they'd learned about healing, and what they thought was missing in the world that would have helped them move along more quickly or more effectively. So once we started the early work and all through the work that we've done since then in designing the website, we have a really very talented group of digital designers working in a co-design experience, which I'll explain, with a cohort of young adult survivors. We chose to target young adults, knowing the statistic many of us have heard, and I've heard a lot from my friends over time now as survivors, that on the average, we often don't talk about our story until we're in our early 50s, which just seems like a tragedy to me, right? So our hope was to be able to bring young adult survivors in, have them teach us the most important problems to solve, and then have them co-design those solutions with us, rather than me, projecting my experience onto somebody who's 40 years younger than me, but with the hope that we could come alongside them in the early stage of their life, before they form deep relationships, before they start careers, just trying to change the trajectory toward healing. So we've had a really amazing group, 2 different groups with some overlap of survivors, very diverse in every dimension we could think of, because our mission is to support survivor healing for all survivors, right? Which sounds like check the box, but it's actually proven to be quite demanding, right? Because survivors are all of us, and their needs are varied, and their access to things like therapy are highly varied. There's no one one solution. So over time, what the survivors really taught us that now is going to show up in this website is that you have to meet survivors where they are. And our intention is to equip them with information and inspiration and a sense of being known, a sense of being supported through community so that they can determine what their next best step to heal is, wherever they are, right? So I still have a next step, best step for me to heal, even though I've done all of this work over my whole lifetime. And I think you would say that. I mean, I just think that's...
Oh, I've said it.
That's the way it is for survivors. By and large, there's always a next step.
Put myself in the shop again for last year. And I can't tell you, working primarily with the organizations that are addressing this issue in Illinois means that you're working with ICASA agencies who concentrate on direct services. And everybody at the agencies is aware of this, but not necessarily able to cope with it, because I've heard stories all the time that so many male survivors, bisexual survivors, gay and lesbian survivors, people who don't identify as a gender, whatever. There is this idea in their heads that agency services are for female rape survivors. And they don't feel they fit, so why should they even go there? And the agencies, they have structures and things in place that have worked for them since the 70s, and it isn't always that easy to adapt and change in a world that's adapting and changing all the time. So when I started getting more familiar with your project, I saw that exemplified so beautifully. And just the first place I saw it was just, the art, the design in all your branding materials. It was addressed so beautifully. And it didn't, so beautifully that it didn't even have to be addressed. You would look at some of these images that are obviously human and individuals, and it just like transcends genders and colors and ethnic identifications, and it was just so obvious. And it was something I had never, for me, getting to learn about your project, it was a very difficult road, but it all came together when I started seeing your visual materials. So I'm kind of curious, did that and of course your survivor cohorts and panels were very closely working with that, but did it kind of jumpstart things once you got some of your visual material together? Did it make it easier for other people like me who don't know the digital world very well?
Sure. Yeah, I think most of us respond more effectively when we can see something. Even if it's just a hypothesis or a place to start that you can pivot from. And so I think it absolutely, and the work that was done that was Firebelly, a design agency here in town who focuses on social impact causes, who did a beautiful job with working with the survivors around the digital or the visual design. And I think it's very reflective of the needs we all have as survivors, where we need to be seen, and we need to know that somebody cares about us and understands us. At the same time, it's imperative that we're safe, right? And that we're in control of our story, we're in control of the message. Yes, and ideally in community. So these images that you'll see in the website, show different versions of that expressed.
Well, and it's interesting because the phrase you hear in our culture now a lot is, I needed to see somebody that looked like me.
Right.
Well, that's not exactly easy to do. There's a lot of me's that we need to, there's a lot of me's out there that we need to show them. But your work kind of transcends that. Maybe it's about, maybe some of these images I'm looking at, they don't look like me, but they don't not look like me. You did such a nice job of kind of globalizing this whole concept of what do survivors look like. So it almost kind of doesn't even matter anymore. It makes that kind of nitpicking irrelevant.
Yeah, and you and I talked about this, I know at some point, Jean, that I feel like we need to connect to survivors at a level that's below that or behind all that. Like all these things that make us different are not that relevant in my experience when it comes to survivor to survivor experience and community, that we connect in a way that allows all that to be true. You know, we're this and we're that and different in every way. But survivors understand each other. Survivors have this super deep empathy that just plays at another level, and that's frankly where we want to stay.
Yeah, more in common. More in common than different.
So Scott, I've got to ask, how did you, in your thinking about this problem and how to solve it, and based on a lot of the professional inspiration that you had, how did you arrive at a web application?
Well, you know, first showing those concepts out in the world, and what everyone said then and what everyone has said pretty much since then is, particularly if they're survivors like I am, they're familiar with how disorganized and disconnected the digital space is around this issue. You know, I worked in Chicago, rode the train for 20 years. I probably Googled, how do I heal from childhood sexual abuse in some form, call it 150 times, right? And what I would get would be RAIN, which is awesome that it's there right off as a crisis resource. But you could barely get off the first page of search results before you're finding like academic papers, right? There's no, what people have been telling us is there's no one place to go for all of us to go to help each other heal. So, and we were clearly up to speed and supportive of the unique value of a digital experience. It just has certain attributes that allow us to address some of the issues that I think are present in survivor healing that are valuable and not present in the current ecosystem, if you will. Things like scaling the solutions, right? I mean, so much of the hugely important work in healing is done face-to-face. Think a therapist. Well, so if you're a therapist, you get X number of patients and their clients and you're done, right? You're maxed out, you're at capacity. Where there are no constraints in the digital space. You don't have any constraints around how many users are participating in this experience. And you can also scale it significantly with a relatively modest financial investment. And when your primary objective...
We'll be returning to that one.
Well, when our start point was really, again, just like knowing how messed up the space is and knowing how under-resourced it is. And, you know, we didn't want to build something that would serve 100 people or 300 people or 500 people. We know that there are tens of millions, if not 100 million survivors in the U.S. And there's maybe another 100 million people who care about those survivors. And we wanted to create something with survivors that created the potential to reach that community broadly.
And a very important point, I think, that I would really like to introduce more into the minds of all executive directors working in our mission area at whatever level they are, is what you hit on with having the focus or the people-facing part of your organization is a digital, that whether you have 10,000 people or 100,000 people that you're interacting with, your overhead for your organization is not going to go through the roof. It scales. Right. And that's like incredibly important if we're trying to reach the 42 million, Project 42 million, that's our plug. It's the only plug I'm going to do for this podcast. You're trying to reach the 42 million survivors of sexual abuse in the United States.
Yeah, and services aren't scalable because, again, you are dealing with individuals, and you know, like if you're in business for yourself and you know you're a trainer. Well, there's 8 to 10 hours a day. You can do 8 to 10 1-hour sessions. Same way if you're a therapist. Same way if you're a volunteer going to the emergency room. These are not scalable. The only way you increase them is more people, which always brings more expense. You know, it's why I've been thinking more and more about we've got to, in addressing this problem, we've got to get past the idea that we have to offer services.
And one thing I wanted to see your opinion on, the lockdowns, right? 3 years, we're 3 years-ish, you know, a lot of things changed. BetterHelp, the kind of the connector for different therapists where they can schedule sessions. Like that one, the amount of people using that went through the roof. And were you guys aware of, and when the Braver Collective was forming, were you looking at different people that have went into different social issues and like provided community? Because in a sense, even though it's just like one-on-one therapy sessions, like it's healing and it's nature.
Yep.
So like in trying to get the healing in the community in the digital, were you looking at other competitors?
Yeah, I don't think we didn't find any competitors in this space
because it doesn't exist.
No, there aren't any.
but we looked at other analogs, I'd say.
Yes.
You know, like Trevor Project's an example. I can think of off the top of my head. We looked at the very community-based, very focused on a particular population that has a lot in common. Plenty of challenges in that space about delivering this information freely and efficiently. And I think it helped open our eyes around how to do that. And there are a lot of, we had a lot of learning about community and how to build community properly and the role community plays in healing. I mean, our learning curve is still straight up. We're just at a point with this group of survivors where we all feel like now's the time to get this out in the world. And we're going to continue to gather feedback from survivors, you know, on into the future, iterate the site, call it once a year to take their feedback and prioritize it and make it even more valuable for survivors. So we're just at a point along this path, but a point I think where, you know, we feel a sense of responsibility to get this out there.
Yep. We have.
You share that sense of urgency.
We have all been there have been some people pushing you on that, haven't there?
Well, and I want to speak to that because I think, you know, I was in the business world when this first came up, and in the business world, when you're starting a new venture, particularly a new digital venture, there's this idea that you guys would be well aware of around, you know, doing a minimum viable product and getting it out in the world as fast as you can, and then learning by doing. You know, people like it or they hate it or they ask you to change this or that, and you just kind of go and you iterate. And
Product market fit.
Right. And, you know, our belief then and now is, yes, we could have gone much faster, but this is too important to just throw something out there that may or may not be helpful, may or may not do damage. You know, we very much have this first do no harm way of thinking about people engaging in this experience. I mean, we're all struggling, so let's just not go backward, right? So we invested the extra time and the extra money with Gene's support and a lot of other people who came alongside and also agreed that it was worth spending more time with survivors to refine the fidelity and make sure that everything that's present in the site has been thoroughly scrubbed to represent something that's essential to our healing. So you're not going to see anything on the site or on the complimentary social media experience that came from any place. You know, nobody had an idea they were projecting out into the survivor world, right?
Yeah.
This is just the opposite. It's like, this is what we need. You know, we have a beautiful quote from one of the young adult survivors who's co-designing with us, gave us some feedback and said, thank you for helping me create the place I've always needed. And for me, that's what we're all doing. We're all going, I wish when I was on that train 15 years ago typing this in that there was a place like this where I could just, in privacy, learn. I could read and understand what happened to me. I could find expert research on healing. I could hear from other survivors about their own healing experiences, you know, and decide how to move forward from there rather than try to piece it together myself, which is what I did as a practical matter because that's all that was available to us, all that is available to us.
Yeah.
But that's such an interesting concept for me because, you know, I assume that people over a certain age are still allowed on your website. You know, if you had asked me that question about, you know, if I had said, thank you for creating the space that I always needed. I was just sitting here thinking, I don't know what that space looks like, because in my world, being born in 1954, those digital spaces didn't exist until like I was over the age of 50. So, what my definition of what did you need, what were you looking for, would have had to have been physical. And that is one area where traditional service providing agencies have been able to create that, some more than others, because some people who, spend a little extra time on creating a beautiful space then are looked at askance by the people who think, well, that's not what you should be spending your money on. Why are you, why on earth are you trying to make a nice kitchen area? Why, can't people just sit on folding chairs? As a person whose butt sat on many, many folding chairs in church basements over the years, I can tell you that no, my space wouldn't have looked anything like that. My space would at least have had comfortable chairs.
Right.
And it would have been a space where I could sit for, so that's really interesting to think about, the ideal, safe, wonderful, supportive space. Maybe it never could exist in the real world. Maybe it had to be digital.
Okay, yeah.
Of course, I would encourage anybody using your site, they're going to be there for a while, they better have a comfy chair wherever they're sitting. Is that something you guys have addressed? Are most people accessing your site? I mean, by what device they're using, and does it make a difference?
It won't be device dependent. So you'll be able to pull it up on your phone, or it's not an app, it's a site.
Well, most people are most comfortable using their
Yeah,
phones.
you can still pop it up on a phone just as easily. And to your point, I think it's just, what we're all learning is the opportunity to create value that's unique in the digital space, right? Like we're 1,000% not interested in competing or trying to replicate what's already in place.
Right.
So there are all these invaluable services which were very important to my own personal healing, which I get. But we talked a little bit before this about my therapist as an example. I'm no longer doing therapy with this guy in particular, but he's a wonderful trauma therapist, and I worked with him for about 10 years. And I showed him this site recently, the prototype, still being developed, but showed him the prototype. And I said, okay, you got to tell me the truth. What do you think? What's your take on this? And the first thing he said is, I'm going to refer this to every one of my clients. And as we talked about it, the reason he's choosing to do that is, like when I went to go see him, I would see him once a week for 50 minutes, which left, 6 more days and 23 more hours to live my life. And I'd walk out and think, okay, well, where can I learn more about that? Where can I find a group of people who really understand me, so I don't continue to walk out of here looking both ways and wondering, if I'm all alone, or believing I'm all alone. And over time, as I began to heal more myself, and I started thinking about supporting other survivors in their healing. And really, to your point, Gene, in terms of like some of us who are a little further down the road as survivors, even though we're focused primarily on designing around young adults, like maybe you might focus on with the iPhone, we were also designing for all survivors, right, just like you would an iPhone, right? And so I think an opportunity as survivors are healing, as we know, it goes like 1 step forward and 3 steps sideways, and it's quite unpredictable. But at the same time, I think we're often in positions where we'd like the opportunity to make sure that someone, say, sharing their story on the site, knows they are heard, and knows that you understand, and that you believe them, and that it's not their fault, and those key messages. And those are things we can do.
I just had an insight, because I've been a little bit stuck in this groove here about what did I need, what would have been my definition of a safe space, what did I need and I wasn't getting. And what my mind was going back to was the first time I walked into the Zacharias Center in Gurnee. They had just built an incredible new facility that was unheard of in this kind of mission area, and it was beautiful, and it had big high ceilings, and the first place you walked into was like a big, you'd call it open concept, now you'd call it open, big open concept space with tons of seating and a big fireplace in the middle, and it was beautiful. So I was thinking to myself, okay, that's, I don't know how common this is with survivors, but I also had huge issues with space because, I think most survivors are abused in tiny spaces where they're all alone and there's no one to call, to yell for help. So I always had a huge problem with not spaces so much. If I was alone, I was fine, but small crowded spaces. So I walked into that space and it was beautiful. I'm going to tie this up to your project in a minute. I walked into that space and it was totally open, and I had never experienced that, and that was wonderful. And it was also beautiful. And I'm a very visual person. I have to have beauty, or don't even talk to me. I mean, you don't have to be beautiful, but the potential for beauty, visual beauty, has to be there. So that was what I saw. That was what I saw when I started looking at your materials. I saw beauty, and then the whole idea of space obviously could transform from my need for physical space to my need for, if it's me and the internet, physical space is irrelevant because you create your own amount of physical space. And maybe that's what we need in order to feel safe, is the sense that not only is this space available, but we can create it. If we're tired of it, we turn it off and go do something else. And it is beautiful.
Yeah.
That might just be my quirk, but I just really, now that I'm thinking about it, I love this idea of, when you say we're creating a safe space for survivors, I don't think I ever got that until just now. We're creating the ability to give survivors the potential for creating their own space.
Absolutely.
It can be as big as they want, it can be as small as they want. It can be noisy, you can have background music on, or it can be quiet.
Yeah, and the complement to that too is the opportunity for all of us to hold space for other people. In terms of more psychological space, psychologically safe space, because we all know that if you don't feel safe, there is no healing.
Right.
That's just requirement one. So whether it's personal safety, like walking into into a new center, or in the digital sense, your landing page is very much like walking into the front door of the experience. And I'm sure we've all had this experience both in physical spaces and in digital spaces where you click in or you open the door, you look around, you go, not my space.
Yeah.
Right? Not safe, not
Right
for
church,
me.
right church, wrong pew.
Right, off we go. And which is, that's important to stay safe. So that's good judgment you need to honor. But there is an opportunity to create a safe place digitally, and to allow people to be there and design it in a way that resonates. And that's part of what's worth the money, in my opinion. Is if you design a digital space with something other than very high-end designers, and if you design it without something that's emotionally engaging, it's not going to scale.
Well, and it's also delivering respect to the survivors. We care enough so that you're not going to have to sit here and squirm on a folding chair for half an hour. I mean, I can remember one of the first reactions I got after I created the Judith Dawn program for the arts, was this guy just looks at me and says, "You mean there's a program?" He didn't even know it was my program. He just said, "You mean there's a program like that?" That's what survivors need. Somebody is creating something for you. And look, we spent some money.
Right.
Because you're important.
And as you said, Jean, it may be that I had coffee this morning with a friend who told me for the first time that her partner's father was abused when he was a child, just like I was, and he's really, really struggled, and he's not going to go to therapy. He's just not part of his world, and just not going to happen, which we think was obviously true for like a huge percentage of survivors. For various reasons, that's not going to happen. But as I talked to this friend of mine, she was just saying, wow, he can go and just stay in this space, anonymously, as long as he wants, and learn and, ask questions, whatever it is. And just, for her, she wanted him to know that he wasn't alone.
Right.
Because he's about my age and still thinks he's the only one. right? And is just all this unresolved trauma, just really struggling with it.
Yeah, I felt like I was the only man on the moon for a long time.
Same.
Until my origin story was when the first time we went to Awakenings, and I met you, Laura, and Liz.
Right.
And I'm like, holy crap! I'm like, there's people doing something about it, and they're not gonna judge me. They're not gonna make fun of me. They're not gonna say like, don't talk about that.
Yeah, they get me.
Yeah, they get me.
Yeah, and again, that speaks to the commonality of experience because you came in there with your partner, Alan. You know, both of you were male survivors, and you were talking to 3 white women.
Yeah.
Diversity in age. That was about it.
That makes me think about something, though. I remember the podcast we did with Ernie and Laura, and then Ernie's approach was you take like a private equity approach to the situation where you have, because a lot of things that I've noticed with, especially like in the business world, is like people continue to repeat, we're working in silos, we're operating in silos, everything's disconnected. We need to get the system, single source of truth. That's the buzzword I've heard a lot. Single source of truth, single source of truth.
There are not versions of the truth.
Yeah, right. We need the data.
Currently being debated, I think.
In a data warehouse. You need to migrate it. But Ernie's approach was like, if you had one group or firm that looked at just Chicagoland, let's say, and went in there and got all these people in one place, the output would be way greater. And what you told me before we started was that you're not. It's a complement to every service that exists.
Exactly.
And it's a digital overlay on top of that. And I think that's just such a wonderful approach because you are figuring out a way to connect all these systems, resources, people, and all in one place, which is what's needed to happen all along. Because I know there's so many, me and Gene talk about all the time, there's so many passionate people working on this, but everybody's running in different directions. Yeah. And it's not, I don't think it's conducive to the type of change we want to see long term.
Or everybody's working on a volunteer basis, you know, or juggling it with the real life need to earn a living.
Right.
You know, wealthy retirees, there's only going to be so many of them, you know, and then the rest of the problems are going to have to be solved by real working people. Right. It's just refreshing to think about that there are different ways, and people of all ages are looking at different ways to solve the same old problem. I mean, there's scaling right there.
Yeah, and I think, just to continue on that same point, Derek, that, I didn't really know much about like who was out there doing what when I started this. I probably hadn't told 5 people I was a survivor until I decided in my whole life, until I decided I needed to go try to do something to be helpful. So age 59. As I got out there, I started to see and started to meet people who were doing really amazing work, right? But there'd be one over there, and then there'd be one down there, and to your point, very disconnected, not by intention, but just by circumstance. And part of what we hope to offer with this experience is something of a digital platform where we can work with someone like Awakenings, who has a specialty around supporting survivors who find healing through art, to lift that up and help all survivors understand that that's a possibility.
Yeah, increase
there's
the audience.
Some potential there. And how does that actually work? And then maybe do a companion piece that says, you can't send everybody in the United States to Awakenings, but how do you find healing in the arts, right? What does that look like? What are those options? Where do you find the connections? It's more, a lot of it is lifting up the people who are doing really good work, broadening it so we could apply it across the survivor spectrum as it, where it's relevant, and then equipping the survivors to pursue that in their own space. We can't, at this point, we're not really aspiring to find out who a trauma therapist is in a little town in Kansas, right, to connect people with. What we're going to do is say, hey, if you feel like therapy might be something for you, then here's how to think about, here's what talk therapy does, and here's when it works, and here's when it struggles, and here's EMDR, and here's, all of the primary healing modalities, and then equip survivors with the information and the inspiration and the sense of being surrounded by community, so they can take responsibility for their own healing, right? Because that's the only way it works. As important as community is, we all know that you don't heal at the community level. You heal, at the individual survivor level. So it's all about, Judith Herman, right, in trauma and recovery. If the primary impact of being raped is that you feel disconnected and disempowered, then our responsibility, if we want to support survivor healing, is to restore that sense of power and help people know they're not alone. Step one, step two. And we can do that in this digital space.
And to me, it's ingenious that the world's moving by these things. Yeah. And if you want to get to people, it's got to be through one of these. Obviously you can use it. You could use it supports in any device, but if you don't have everything that you need right here, that's just the way things are.
You're not going to bother.
Yeah.
Because the stuff that isn't as good is going to be there.
Right. Yeah, that's true too. No, that's absolutely right.
Crap.
The unsafe places on the internet, they're going to be there.
Yeah,
I'm
that
thinking
is true.
about when I was 23, just absolutely out of my mind.
Yeah.
Just out of my mind every day. When I first started looking at my survivor experience, and the iPhones weren't like that how they are now with as many features, but if I could have went on this thing and found community, it would have changed the trajectory of my life without a doubt. Or if I would have been, let's say, 18 years old and I could pull this out, open it up, and feel safe, like, how do you quantify that? Yeah. You really can't. Yeah. And I'm like, so that's why another reason I'm so enthusiastic. I'm like, get it.
Well, we've all had that experience. Even though we're not digital
No,
natives.
I didn't.
Most of us have had that experience.
I wasn't looking on my phone there.
But a lot of people have had that experience. We're so, as a survivor, I was abused as a child, I thought, when I get out of my house, I'm going to be good.
Yeah.
I'm going to put this behind me. Never going to think about it again. I'm going to be fine. And then, of course, I get out of my house like, oh my gosh, I'm not even close to being fine. I have no idea what's going on here. And the very last thing I wanted to do was to tell any other human being that I was a survivor. That was just not on the radar, right? But there was no place to go. There was no place to learn. You go to a big bookstore and there might be like 2 books or whatever, just no resources for survivors,
Some
right?
obscure medical journal.
Yeah, it's just the way it is because we can't talk about it as a society, and if you can't talk about it, you're not going to resource it. But you know what? All that's true. All that has been true, and we don't have to change everything in order to start to heal, right? We can start to heal right now. We just need to tweak things a bit so this information, this community is accessible. Accessibility is a huge issue, as we all know. It needs to be free, needs to resonate emotionally with the people we're focused on. It needs to be trustworthy. Ideally, we scale it indefinitely so it's free, and it needs to be communicated at a level that the broadest group of survivors say, okay, you're talking to me.
Well, as enjoyable as it is talking about the beauty of Braver Collective and the potential of Braver Collective, this is Project 42. So we're going to talk about some of the things that people don't like to talk about, which is money, which is numbers and money and funding. And I know from having worked with you over the past couple years that you have been very successful as a fundraiser. And as I have always tried to tell you, you have been doing it a little bit differently. And since we talked on the podcast the last time, Derek and I have learned a lot more and have addressed some of these topics in previous podcasts. So I'd kind of like to run our thinking by you a little bit and not only have you comment on it, but share your own experiences, because I have told you for a long time, I'm a fan of Shark Tank. I think you approach the idea of putting together the funds for a different kind of nonprofit in a different way. And I felt that you followed a venture capitalist model. Because I remember a conversation where you talked about, I started with my funding and, there was a friends and family stage, and then there was a widen that out to every, your friends and family's friends and family. And I just thought, well, gosh, isn't that kind of like a venture capitalist thing? So I'd really like to approach it on that level, because nobody else is doing it like that, Scott. And I'll expand on that probably, inevitably, a little bit later. But let's hear what you did that's differently before we tell you why and how we think it's different.
Well, I spent almost 40 years in the business world by the time I decided to do this. So that was, hardwired into my brain, and we were very involved in new business activities, business creation activities, and so on, in the work that I've been doing. And you're absolutely right, Gene. It was very much I came to believe that this venture capital model, the model that for-profit companies use to start new ventures, had application in our space, particularly because some people just told me that's the way it needed to work. So I knew, I wanted to pay. I paid for the first project that I described when we were just going out and showing people ideas and getting to a proof of concept, which is the end result of that first step. I paid for that myself, which, I had the money to do it, which is a privilege. So I recognize that. But I felt it was important for me to, make my own investment, take my own stake. And then as I talked to major funders, potential funders in this space, they told me kind of what I've since learned is like, before you come talk to us, you need to go talk to your friends and family, people who actually know you, and see if they trust you with this, right? See if they believe in what you're doing, because if they don't, we won't. Not interested.
Interesting.
And so I didn't really want to go raise money for my friends, but
They told you had to.
they told me I had to, and of course a lot of my friends are business people, and they got why that was the case, that we need to take this through a series of steps, and so received a lot of support from my friends. Now, one thing I'll pause and say right there is, as I said, I hadn't been telling anyone I was a survivor up until I started in this work, and then all of a sudden I'm telling every friend I have that I'm a survivor, and which for me felt very scary and very risky, and you just don't know. I'd always had this, I think, thought that maybe we wouldn't be friends in the same way if they knew that about me. And
A valid concern.
Yeah.
right, and the beautiful thing, of course, is that when you take the chance, if you're doing it in a safe way with safe people, you find out that guess what? It's hard to find somebody who isn't impacted by this issue themselves. That the financial community now that supports us, as an example, I would say, even those representing institutional support, probably 75% are either survivors themselves or very directly impacted. My daughter, my dad, whatever the case may be. So I started getting a lot of support from individual major donors who had the same frustration we did. They go look for resources for their daughter who's been raped, and they can't find anything that they feel good about. How do I understand it? How do I support my daughter? So I started getting some momentum there, and then as we were able to fund the initial projects with friends and family support, then I felt more confident talking to people like Gene and others who have a lot of expertise in understanding the space way better than I, and who are, like a venture capital or like a private equity firm, right, who specializes in making targeted investments into new ventures.
Firms like that who specialize in new ventures, do they specialize in nonprofit new ventures?
No, and that's where, that's why it doesn't, the logic of the flow of that kind of series of steps resonates with people who tend to have a lot of money because they're that's how they operate or understand how things operate in the for-profit world. So it translates back intuitively, I think, to the potential funders, but there are no active funders I'm aware of who are putting pools of capital together to really position themselves as in that venture capital, venture philanthropy, which is basically the place we've been in from then until when we launch, is just it's admittedly a tough place, I think, to get support. But we were able to get support from individuals in this space. We were very fortunate to get a grant from the Oak Foundation, which is a large supporter of these causes globally, out of their kind of venture pool. So there's there's capital available for that.
Real quick about the
Sure.
Oak one. So you'd say, like, when you talk to your people, they're like, step one, leverage your network, get to a proof of concept. Was that key in getting the grant from the Oak Foundation?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So, like,
I mean,
that was like number one, like on the list. Like,
yeah, you
dude,
can't skip to the end.
Right.
Did they give you any specifics? Did they say anything like you have to raise X before?
Well, I probably shouldn't get too much into the specifics of our relationship with them, other than they're very, very easy to work with and very supportive. They had an expectation. Well, maybe first to address your point, Derek. They're like the third step in the food chain over here, right? So I couldn't go over there and just talk to them about an idea I had.
Right.
The day after I had it.
Yeah. Hey guys.
It needs to firm up, right? And the firming up was largely a function of survivors engaging in those, as we talked about earlier, the survivors being engaged in this experience to help us understand the problems to be solved and the way to solve them.
Yes.
Okay.
And the Oak Foundation has deep expertise in understanding this space, and they got it. They want survivors to be at the center of the experiences that are designed, because there's way too much room for waste if you're not listening to survivors when you design experiences, whether they're physical or digital. And they didn't want any waste. They didn't want us spending money on something that we could get, for free, or something that'd be purely redundant. Again, when everything's so resource starved. So the idea that we could be a platform to not only not waste money by building redundant resources, but pull those best practices onto a space and lift them up.
Yeah, well, I didn't mean to get into specifics. I guess what I'm really trying to figure out in my own head right now was this a theme that when you got to stage 2 or stage 3 and you're approaching institutional funders instead of individuals, did you hear this theme, coming back to you? It's just like, you have to be at a certain level. You have to have already raised X, or you have to at least have demonstrated that people who knew you have already bought in. Because, that's actually encouraging to me. If institutional funders are thinking at the same level as banks, banks don't lend you any money until you prove that you don't need it. But, it's the same kind of thinking. Was that a theme? Was that a commonality? Did you run across that as you were asking for larger amounts or approaching people who had larger pools?
Well, I'd say a couple of things. One is we're clearly, we're going to launch in a couple of months. We're clearly not out there in the world yet. And therefore, we are not qualified to seek funding from a lot of institutional providers who want you to be present and delivering value. And I'm not pushing back against this, right? Delivering metrics to prove you're successful. Yeah, it's just where we are. So, focusing on individuals and institutions who have an appetite and a comfort with being involved in that venture space. When you've done some work to prove it up, they have some reason to believe that you're on the right path, and they want to be a part of making a real difference. The money that you can invest at that point has the potential to be really transformational. And absent folks like that, you never get to the institutional people. So, check back with me when you've 2 years in or whatever it is.
Which makes me think of another question. Larger funders, did you find yourself dealing with an element of surprise very often, or are larger funders more sophisticated than that? Because this is something that I deal with over and over and over again, and probably it's like the number of people who are surprised by how many people that this impacts. Yes. I mean, I'm not talking about on the individual level, because there's plenty of people that don't know that. But as you were approaching larger and more sophisticated funders, did you run into that element of surprise very often when you quoted statistics at them and they'd go like, oh, come on, there's really that many? Or was everybody a little bit beyond that?
You know, it was kind of I eliminated that because I had a bias toward folks at the bigger space who I already knew were familiar with the space and make investments in this space. So I did the individuals that were surprised were more on the major donor side. Okay. Friends and family.
But when you say this space, there aren't that many big funders that make investments specifically in this space. It will be attached to some sort of other social justice, human, human social services, some other kind of agenda. So I assume you're talking about that, because other than the one that we just mentioned, I know of no other people who have it specifically as part of their mission. It gets tacked on to a million other things.
Right. I think it's, like mental wellness perhaps, or mental health. And
then you got to segue out from there.
And actually, I think to that point, Gene, that, if we kind of continue to extrapolate this on out as a nonprofit in this space, once you're launched and you begin to produce results, sure, you're going to have more opportunity for people who fund in this space to list, to be open to your pitch. But given the lack of resources relative to the need in this space, if we're going to produce solutions that have the potential to impact this world at scale, we're going to have to find revenue opportunities that are more like the one you're describing, where there are pools allocated toward trauma healing in this entity, whether it's a government entity or it's a for-profit entity, but they don't have the expertise, things like that. Or where something in our case where digital just clearly adds an incremental value to something that's already present. But if, like in our case in particular, if our commitment from an access perspective is to always make this free to the survivor, whether we're serving one survivor or a million survivors, we're going to have to find resources to, in the background, support that.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like your approach was more of a software launch or like a tech startup.
As opposed to starting a new nonprofit.
Yeah. I mean, I served on a lot of nonprofit boards and so on, but I never started a nonprofit. So I think some of it is just my own naivete kind of was helpful, right? That what I was familiar with and what my friends and family were familiar with and the people I could naturally extend to, they found this to be kind of this Silicon Valley model to be, it just makes sense, right? It's like, you start yourself, tell us how it goes, and then get your buddies to support you. If they don't, it's been nice knowing you, right? But if they do, and then you make another step, then come talk to us.
And I would like to point out that naivete is an essential ingredient for somebody who wants to found a nonprofit. You said you were, and I know I was, and I think you would say that you were.
I'm the most naive person in the room.
I mean, I saw at least 2 templates for other nonprofits before we nailed down that we were doing Project 42.
Yeah.
Without naivete, there would be no new nonprofits formed.
Yeah. A lean digital scalable platform.
Right. That's it. 100%.
And I think that is those conversations. And again, this is not. I think one problem we've always run into, Gene, is like we're not criticizing what anybody's doing in this space at all, or like what we've talked about, at least at the Illinois level and the CASA agencies and all these different organizations that are like cutting each other's That's not where.
Oh,
I'm
in
not
a few
gonna go-
cases.
But they're fighting.
fighting
They're
each
fighting
other.
over a very, very limited amount of resources. Like you created your own open network to generate capital and resources that are going to continue to fund and grow it. Like everybody's waiting on different legislations to pass or this or that. It's like that model's not scalable. It's not effective. It's not going to grow. It's not going to help you reach 42 million people.
No, you're going to put
Second time
Band-Aids
plugging it.
on 200 or 300 people a year.
Like we interviewed an executive director of a very awesome organization in Chicago that does amazing work, and they're like on the front lines. They're essentially first responders, and she was telling us that they had therapists that would immediately start working with kids after they'd been abused in person. They had a backlog of 1,200 kids that couldn't get therapy.
Right, the waiting list.
And they're predominantly funded by the city and the federal government. I mean the state government. And because the model that they have and everything is like so overlapped and entrenched that like to go walk into that organization that's probably staffs maybe 40 people and tell them, hey, you guys need to come up with an entirely new model to fund so you don't have a backlog of 1,200 kids. It's like that's not going to work, But the future of there are solutions where that's possible.
Yeah, I think something I mentioned earlier that was both sad but also I think turned out to be pivotal in terms of our getting the funding that we needed was the prevalence of this issue. Mm-hmm. If you assume the only people who care about this issue and want to invest in it are already doing that, so they're all identified and they're funding this organization, that organization, I just think we're leaving a massive amount of resources, on the table, because the reality is, maybe the first 10 people I talk to, 8 of them have been impacted. They say, I was raped, right? My daughter was raped, right? My buddies in high school, were raped. And people care. And I just think there's way more potential. It's not comfortable as a culture for us to talk about this, but the culture's changing, I think, to some degree. And it's for me, it felt very risky and scary to start having these conversations. But what I've found is as you're able to do that, people care about this and they want it to be better. I don't have to explain to people this is a messed up space in terms of like supporting people to heal. Everyone knows that, right? You just have to bring something that gives them hope that it might make a difference. And I think not everyone, but enough of them will jump on it.
Well, speaking as a writer, which I usually do, it's not enough that there's already these huge issues about how do you even introduce the topic in a room full of people who are there to have a nice dinner or something, so there's that. And then on top of everything else, then, okay, say you take that step, you're a caring person, you want to give, you want to, invest your money into finding solutions and maybe new solutions. Then you start running into all these really bad cultural perceptions about how to do that. Because as a donor who's been donating for a very long time, well over 20 years, I still hear over and over again, yes, but I want my dollars to go to programs, not to administration. Now, how do you, and yet at the same time, the agencies you're donating to, they can't grow. There are all these restrictions, they're offering services, here's what they can do. They're relying on government funding. This is how many survivors they can help a year. A couple hundred, and there's 42 million. These are the same people who will say, I don't want my dollars to go to administration. Well, how do you scale? How do you grow? How do you help more people without marketing and media and fundraising? And until people understand that a little bit better, then it's kind of like we're screwed from both directions. and I'm getting very frustrated with all this because I now find that there's this whole language thing growing up around the whole issue of fundraising. Nobody even wants to say fundraising. Nobody wants to say revenues. It's advancement. It's stewardship. Oh, I can't tell you. That one isn't quite as popular as it was 5 or 6 years ago. But people would say my title is Director of Stewardship, and I'd be like, what, you work for a church? So we have to call it all these other names because now we don't want to sound like we care about raising money. It's madness. It's madness, and that's one of the reasons that we do these podcasts, because we're the ones that are going to talk about. We're the ones that are going to talk about that. So, is this something you've done it smart? You apparently did all your research first, and you didn't waste your time targeting or going places that were no use going to.
Right.
But, you've read the book Uncharitable.
Right.
You know what I'm talking about. Give me your perspective on why in the nonprofit sector are there so many people who think that fundraising is somehow dirty?
Well, I probably don't know enough people in the nonprofit sector to really.
Did you run into that? Were there people who told you, yes,
Well, I think
yes,
in
I'll
general,
support
people-
Braver Collective, but I want my dollars to go into internet design. Don't you dare put it toward growth or marketing or.
Yeah, I don't think yet. I completely understand that point, and I think that is, as I understand it, kind of the broad cultural institutional framework to think about how to support nonprofits, and I think it's highly dysfunctional. I think that it may have. Or let me say it a different way. When I think about the level of investment we're making into this, and thanks to you and others, it's quite a bit more than probably a typical young non-for-profit would invest. But we are making an explicit commitment and promise to scale. We are going to grow. That's fundamental to how we design. That's fundamental to our mission. Mm-hmm. And, that's, in my mind, you talk to people in Silicon Valley, they're cool to make investments to grow. Mm-hmm. If you're asking to make incremental investments to maintain the status quo, it's like next conversation. Mm-hmm. So I just think, stepping outside of the model you're in, stepping outside of that mindset, and not easy, I'm sure, but stepping out of that, and even if you have to create something outside of your traditional organization, but just whatever you need to do to free yourself up, I think you can have a different conversation with different people. Mm-hmm. I think assuming that everything's the same is even though the big picture may not be that encouraging, that doesn't dictate the success that any of us have in terms of trying to support survivor healing. It's not the big picture, mm-hmm. right? It's the conversations you can have with Gene and Derek and people in the world who are good people who want to make a difference. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that creating an informed donor and support base. Yeah. They under, like, everybody's all in.
Yeah, they know why they're funding what they're funding.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's lost in a lot of other, at least from what I've seen in this nonprofit mission area, is that it's kind of like a gala event you go to once a year. You cut a check, maybe not. You don't know how much it is, but there's no there's no vision. There's no vision to it. There's no direction. There's no.
Yeah, I don't know, and I think
you're walking into these meetings, and correct me if I'm wrong. You're walking into these meetings saying, "Look, this proof of concept we know is going to be able to reach potentially millions of people, right. And this is how it's going to look, and this is how it's going to work." And that is, for me anyway, that's why I think it's so innovative.
It costs more up front, but we're investing in that potential.
Right.
Right. Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, in the business world too, if you have a business that you're running that has no growth opportunity, mm-hmm. then you should, crunch it down, make it as cost efficient as possible. You should be looking at metrics like that. Mm-hmm. They're very focused on the resources required to deliver the value you're delivering. But in my opinion, again, there's so much need here. We need to invest as much as we can into things that have the potential make a broader impact, and those business models have a different dynamic. You know, the people who want to support that are not interested in, you know, gee, can't you work your overhead down? They're like, what are you investing in that's going to put us in the best position to scale this up? Because that's what you're investing in.
Big problems need big solutions.
What I'm taking away from all this is Scott is way smarter than I am, and he didn't waste his time going to people that didn't get it.
Not true.
Well, but you did, I mean,
like everyone else.
research up front. I mean, I think from what I've been listening to you talk about now, you kind of had, you did more in terms of identifying good fundraising potential targets.
Yes.
Then I think you put the research in up front, so you didn't waste your time and energy having to explain yourself 50 times over, or quote some statistics, or try to convince people, yes, rape does happen in the home. You know, so.
And just to be clear, you know, I've asked for money plenty of times when it didn't work out. That just goes with the territory.
No, you're the only one that's happened to.
Failing is learning, right? So, you know, I probably learned more by people who declined me than the people who said yes early on. So, no, I do think there's something to be learned from the for-profit world in this space that is useful.
Again, thank you for the time and your work and the education. And I've got 2 files on my laptop right now. I've got like the notes for the show, and then I've got the notes on how to, I've got Scott's cheat sheet on what to do, how to do it, when to do it, the who, what, where, when, why, how. But
Well, since it sounds like we're in the wrap-up phase, I want to state again so that nobody is confused. Scott's project, Braver Collective, is going to be out there in what he calls a soft launch. What's the date again in June?
July.
June. No, soft launch by the end of June.
Right. It should be public by the end of July.
And then should be public by the end of July.
Bravercollective.org.
Bravercollective.org.
There's a site out there now, by the way, that's just a landing page, kind of, you know, people can come and donate and hear a little bit about the story. That's not the site. That's a placeholder. So,
yes,
yeah.
placeholders.
Yeah,
yes.
so we'll go live by the end of July if everything goes as planned.
That's not very long from now. That's not very long from now.
it's going to be like that. 'Cause last time I
Don't
saw
remind me.
Yeah, I feel like it was yesterday that we got breakfast.
Yes. Oh, I know. It's just. It's
Well, I
amazing.
wish
I'm thrilled about it.
I love the connectivity of the internet, but selfishly, I wish you were still in Chicago.
I love being back here. I really do. And I love
And
working with you
we are
guys.
very privileged that during your lean, mean time in Chicago that you have to devote, unfortunately, to still some more fundraising, you made time to be with us here today. So thank you, Scott.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for being a pioneer.